Nobel Prize winning economist James Buchanan explains what he calls economic odds in his paper, Afraid to be Free. According to Buchanan, the government as savior view can be derived from Keynesian economic thought, as expressed when citizens may generally want to extend the parental role of the welfare state to allow the state to replace God. And just to be fair, he doesn't say too many good things about deists as well. But Keynesian economic thought, and you come from the Austrian Economics School. I always want to preface what you always preface, because you always do. So I'll tee it up for you. It's not that this derives from only Austria, but that it comes from people from Austria. And so looking at the Wikipedia page for Austrian economics when I was first starting it, it's terrible. I read it and I'm like, this sounds all gobbledygook. So what's the best way that we can describe Austrian economics? And obviously we don't want to replace God with the state as the Keynesians do. So what would be the main kind of differences between Austrian economics, your school, and Keynesian economics? Like that tends to be kind of the most popular one for the past 100 years, 90 years.
Yeah. Okay. So, and this is always tricky too. And if you ask different Austrians, they're going to say different things about, what are the defining attributes of the school. So yes, at the basic level, it's a school of thought, just like there's a Chicago school, a Keynesian school, as you mentioned, and it's called Austrian because Karl Menger, the founder, was from Austria. So originally that was a term of derision because it was like the German historical school economists. This is back in the 1870s.
Back when there was an Austria.
Yeah, right. They were looking down their nose upon Menger and his disciples that were emerging. And so they said, oh, that's just Austrian economics. That's a backwater. It's not like here in Germany, which is the center of, scholarship. That was where the term came from.
And then World War II happened.
Yeah.
It's amazing too, just to sidetrack you completely, how much philosophy is lost and how much bad philosophy comes out of Germany during World War II time that we could have quashed. And I'm pretty sure we wouldn't have people writing things like misquoting Jesus because they come from a school of thought that should just be debunked. But because it took so long to come over, it never had the ability to be impacted by other theories. So you just had, Germany coming up with both good and bad ideas during World War II time, and it really needed to be quashed, especially for anything Bart Ehrman does.
Yeah, I mean, it really is amazing. I don't know when to start it, but 1850 to World War I. The intellectual milieu of all the people meeting in, Vienna and in Germany, and just all the thinkers involved and people coming and going in different circles, or even just Mises' private seminar, when you see the list of who's who and the people that, came in and out of those circles, it's a lot of not just economists, but, other major philosophers and political scientists and so forth.
Yeah.
So yeah, the Austrian school, it's individualistic, and I don't mean politically. I just mean it builds up from the individual as the locus of analysis, and as opposed to if you say, well, what else would it be? I mean, because there are types of economics that just look at big macro variables, like to say, oh, what's the price level? Well, you look at the money supply, you look at the velocity with which dollar bills turn over, and then you can back out, what the price per unit good. That sort of thing, where it's, it's looking at the economy just as a bunch of big numbers, as opposed to, individual decisions. And, that you could say, oh, well, prices, we start with individuals and they want to hold money, and what's the demand for money and that sort of thing. So the Austrian economics certainly it's called methodological individualism, and the other one's methodological subjectivism. And I know those are big words, but just saying it, they assume individuals are the concrete, the atoms that form the analysis, and that they have subjective goals. So Karl Menger, who was the founder of the Austrian school, in a standard history of economic thought book, would be credited as one of the three people who ushered in what's called the marginal revolution. So that was overturning old classical value theory and replacing it with the new modern subjective value theory. So that's a defining element of Austrian economics, because their founder was one of the people that brought that revolution. And so there, what does that mean? It's just saying when you're trying to explain prices, the ultimate building block, or the fundamental building block, is the fact that people have subjective preferences. And so ultimately, why is a bottle of wine cost whatever $50? Why is the price $50? You don't start and say, oh, well, because the grapes were really expensive, and so the bottle of wine has to cost that much. Otherwise, the producer wouldn't, be able to cover his cost. That, nowadays, the way the economists think, that causality is backwards. It's that the final goods that consumers buy is because they have utility for the consumer in the eye of the beholder. And then that works its way backwards. And that's why people are willing to pay for grapes, because they can be used to make the wine. Okay. So that type of thinking, that's something that Carl Menger helped usher in. And then, one of the things, the reason I think it's important nowadays for people to know about the Austrian school, this guy, Ludwig von Mises, he developed a theory of the business cycle that other schools of thought can't yield, because the Austrian school has what's called an emphasis on capital structure. So just real briefly, I realize I'm throwing out some big buzzwords here, but in the Austrian tradition, they pay a lot of attention to the fact that production takes time, and that things go through stages, let's call them. So this is going to be simplistic, but just so your listeners understand where I'm coming from. Like, to get loaves of bread into the grocery store, that first they got to plant the wheat, then it's got to go to the next stage to the miller, and then it goes to the baker, and so on. And that type of process, Austrians really take that seriously in their modeling. And in particular, they look at how do interest rates kind of help coordinate the structure of that production process that might, when you're looking at any particular good in its life cycle, as it were, it might take years to develop before the thing that you see, in the store available for purchase. And because the Austrians spend so much time and care developing that understanding of that framework, that's why they can then come in and say, oh, and so if the central bank comes in and artificially manipulates interest rates, say by flooding the market with cheap credit that pushes down interest rates so they're artificially low, then they can see what would happen. Oh, it might cause an unsustainable boom, right? So that kind of explanation or theory, other schools of thought like the Keynesians can't even really develop, because their model doesn't have this capital structure that unfolds over years. So that it's not that the Austrian story is wrong in that approach. It's like you couldn't even tell that story in a standard Keynesian framework, because the standard Keynesian framework is just it's real macro and aggregated, and there's not enough distinctions or subtlety in detail to allow that sort of story to unfold. So I'm just there. That's not like the definition of the Austrian school, but I'm just explaining that's one of the components of it that I think make it so relevant nowadays, because that's such an important element of our lives right now. Central banks, in my opinion, engaging in very destructive behavior.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I don't know, which hand was shaking what, but with presuppositional apologetics, we have certain axioms that we hold to, and there's not a equation that we put everything in and say, okay, add the Kalam argument plus the resurrection accounts, historicity by various non-biblical writers, and it all equals out to Christianity is true. We hold the fact that Christianity is true, and then derive certain principles from that. And so with Austrian economics, I see people they act with purpose, whether or not those purposes are right or wrong. That's not the argument.